When President Andrew Jackson removed federal deposits from the Second Bank of the United States and put them into local state banks, he was widely seen as destroying the nation's financial system. Was he? What we are about to tell you will astonish you. Mr. Jackson took office during a severe economic depression, a severe credit contraction caused by the failure of a number of large state banks. His decision to kill the central bank further destabilized the situation and led to the complete collapse of several more banks. And yet, despite all this, he is remembered as one of the greatest presidents in American history. How can that be? What really happened to the nation's financial system after the death of the second central bank? Let us go back to the beginning. In 1812, the United States went to war with Great Britain. By 1814, it was clear that the inexperienced and underprepared American military was going to lose. So President James Madison turned to the only expedient he could think of to keep his administration afloat: borrowing and spending. But no one would lend to him because he had nothing to offer as collateral. So he turned to the next best thing. His administration simply stole money from the nation's banks. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of counterfeit U.S. currency flooded into the economy, and soon the whole thing began to unravel. People started hoarding specie, refusing to accept the nation's paper money. Businesses folded, farms were abandoned, and a deep depression gripped the nation. At the end of the conflict, there were two choices open to the government. First, it could allow the fraudulent banks to fail and let the free market heal the damage done to the economy. Or second, it could protect the banks, organize the fraud, and perpetuate the losses. Congress chose the latter course, creating the nation's third central bank, called the Second Bank of the United States. This new institution was almost an exact carbon copy of the previous one. It too could create money for the federal government and regulate state banks, influence larger amounts of capital, and was better organized across state lines than the old bank. Consequently, its policies had a greater impact on the creation and extinguishing of the nation's money supply. For the first time in 360 years, the effects began to ricochet across the entire country at once, instead of being confined to geographical regions. The age of the boom-bust cycle had at last arrived in America. But what is a boom-bust cycle? A boom-bust cycle is an economic cycle that features an initial boom period of rapid growth and expansion, followed by a bust marked by economic decline and recession. During the boom phase, there is usually a surge in economic activity, investment, and consumer spending, fueled by easy credit and a sense of optimism. However, this expansion is often unsustainable and eventually leads to a reversal. The bust phase is characterized by a sharp decline in economic indicators such as GDP, employment, and investment, often accompanied by financial crisis or market crashes. Boom-bust cycles are common in market economies and can be attributed to various factors, including speculation, overinvestment, credit expansion, and shifts in consumer confidence. They can have significant impacts on individuals, businesses, and the overall economy, leading to unemployment, bankruptcies, and economic downturns. Governments and policymakers often try to mitigate the severity of these cycles through regulations and interventions aimed at promoting stability and sustainable growth. With the Second Bank of the United States firmly in control of the nation's purse strings, the stage was set for another round of economic abuse. Under its directorship, hundreds of new state banks were chartered, many of which were little more than glorified gambling houses. These banks issued their own banknotes, which were backed by the bank's promise to exchange them for specie at any time. The trouble was that they rarely had enough specie on hand to cover their obligations, and many of them failed. When they did, people who held their notes lost everything. By 1820, public opinion began to swing back in favor of the sound money principles espoused by the Jeffersonian Republicans. But by then, that party had completely abandoned those principles. So a new coalition was formed, headed by Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson, called the Democrat Party. One of its primary platforms was the abolishment of the bank. After Jackson was elected in 1828, he began in full earnest to bring that about. The head of the bank was a formidable adversary by the name of Nicholas Biddle. not only possessed great personal abilities, but many members of Congress were indebted to him for business favors. Consequently, the bank had many political friends. As Jackson's first term of office neared its end, Biddle asked Congress for an early renewal of the bank's charter, hoping that Jackson would not risk controversy in a re-election year. The bill was easily passed, but Jackson accepted the challenge and vetoed the measure. Thus, a battle over the bank's future became the primary presidential campaign issue. Jackson was re-elected by a large margin, and one of his first acts was to remove federal deposits from the bank and place them into private, regional banks. Biddle counterattacked by contracting credit and calling in loans. This was calculated to shrink the money supply and trigger a national panic depression, which it did. He publicly blamed the downturn on Jackson's removal of deposits. The plan almost worked. Biddle's political allies succeeded in having Jackson officially censured in the Senate. However, when the truth about Biddle's strategy finally leaked out, it backfired against him. He was called before a special congressional investigative committee to explain his actions. The censure against Jackson was rescinded, and the nation's third central bank passed into history. The demise of the second bank of the United States should have brought stability and prosperity to the nation. Why didn't it? Well, the answer is simple. The death of a central bank does not automatically bring about prosperity. There must also be a decrease in the amount of counterfeiting, speculation, and corruption that goes on within the financial system. In this case, none of those things decreased. If anything, they got worse. In fact, immediately following the death of the second bank of the United States, four separate financial panics rocked the American economy. The first occurred in 1837 as a result of British investors withdrawing their funds from American banks. This caused a run on specie that nearly emptied the vaults of the few remaining specie-backed banks. However, the other banks quickly stepped in to help prevent a total collapse. The second panic occurred in 1841 as a result of New York merchants speculating on cotton prices. The excessive speculation bubble burst and left several prominent merchants bankrupt. The third panic occurred in 1857 as a result of a failed attempt to corner the gold market, and the fourth occurred in 1866 as a result of reckless lending practices by some of the nation's largest banks. All four of these events led to sharp declines in business activity, investment, and employment, as well as a general decline in the price of stocks, bonds, and real estate. Why did all this happen? Because the fundamental problems of the financial system remained. In fact, they got worse. Before the demise of the second bank of the United States, there were only a few dozen banks in the nation. Afterwards, there were hundreds. Unfortunately, most of these new banks were not well managed and engaged in all kinds of shady practices. For example, many of them allowed wealthy insiders to borrow large sums of money, which they then used to buy stock in the very banks that lent the money to them. This created a system of insider dealing and corruption that made it nearly impossible for outsiders to succeed. Additionally, many of these banks engaged in excessive speculation, which further destabilized the financial system. For example, they might lend money to a businessman who wanted to buy a farm, but instead of using the loan to buy the farm, the businessman would use it to buy stock in the bank that lent him the money. This created a situation where the banks were making money by selling financial products that were essentially worthless. Furthermore, many of these banks were located in areas that were not well regulated, which meant that they could engage in all kinds of risky behavior without fear of government intervention. For example, many of them lent money to people who were not able to repay it, knowing that the government would bail them out if they got into trouble. Finally, many of these banks were owned by foreign investors who were not subject to the same regulations as domestic banks. This meant that they could engage in all kinds of risky behavior without fear of government intervention. For example, many of them lent money to people who were not able to repay it, knowing that the government would bail them out if they got into trouble. In conclusion, the demise of the second bank of the United States did not bring stability and prosperity to the nation because the fundamental problems of the financial system remained. In fact, they got worse. The explosion of new banks, the prevalence of insider dealing and corruption, the excessive speculation, the lack of regulation in many areas, and the presence of foreign-owned banks all contributed to the instability of the financial system and ultimately led to the four panics that rocked the nation in the years following the demise of the Second Bank of the United States. Thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed the video. If you want to learn more about the corrupt origins of our current financial system, stay tuned for more information.